Okay. Hello everyone. We are apparently streaming live on YouTube, which is very exciting. The one person watching is our friend Andrew in Sweden. Hi Andrew!
That would have freaked him out quite a bit.
So welcome to the guest of honour interview with the amazing Jen Williams, who needs no introduction, but I'm about to give her one anyway. My name is Juliet Mushens and I am Jen's literary agent. So when they asked me if I would do the guest of honour interview, I was really stressed about it, thinking how much am I going to have to prep? And then I was like, not at all, because I've represented her for 8 years and read every single thing she's written. So it turned out to be a joy coming up with these questions. So Jen Williams is a British fantasy novelist and short story writer. She lives in South East London, Campbell well represented, where she works as a bookseller and copywriter. Her first 3 novels, The Copper Promise, The Iron Ghost and The Silver Tide, were nominated for British Fantasy Awards, but cruelly robbed. And she won the British Fantasy Award in 2018 and 2019 for The Ninth Reign and The Bitter Twins.
Justice, finally.
Jen Williams and some guy called Den Patrick began a monthly social group for fantasy fans called the Super Relaxed Fantasy Club. Her latest novel, Thriller, Dog Rose Dirt, was published in 2021 by HarperCollins in the UK and Crooked Lane Books in the US, and has just been optioned for TV. Very exciting.
Yeah,
so
very exciting for me.
I've got a lot of questions to get through, many of which started out as trolling Jen and then actually more professional. And then I'm going to kick things open to the floor for about the last 15 minutes. So if you have any questions for Jen, do save them up. So to start at the beginning, when did you begin writing seriously? And did you always intend to write and publish fantasy, or did you dabble in different genres?
Well, the very first thing I remember wanting to do was to be a writer. You have to picture tiny 5-year-old Jen with a bowl haircut, let's say circa 1987. Really keen on writing stories. The first thing I remember asking for Christmas was a desk, which is really lame when I think about it now. And then a typewriter, I think, the year after that, because I realised that typewriter was probably more important than the desk in terms of writing. So yeah, I always wanted to write stories. And then at secondary school and kind of that point in your life when you're supposed to be thinking about your career, a lot of people had advice about how writing, isn't really a career for, for normal people. So I kind of, when you're that age, you do listen to what adults say, unfortunately. So I kind of took that on board and decided that instead I was going to go to art college. Because being quite contrary, I decided to try the other career that's impossible to get into, which is illustration, which apparently is even harder than being a published author. But then, I went through art college. I did enjoy myself, but ultimately when I came out of it, I still wanted to write stories. So I eventually kind of fell back into writing things. And I think it was when I was working full-time at Waterstones for a few years, and I had a really, really bad day at work. And people always think that working in a bookshop is like endless bliss and sort of just lounging about in chairs reading books. God bless Waterstones, but it's not, I mean, obviously it's being live streamed, so I don't want to annoy Waterstones, but, there were times when it was rough. And I had a particularly bad day, and I came home and I thought, do you know what would cheer me up? It's just writing for a bit. So I wrote a scene, and I wrote a bit more, and eventually that became a book, which was a surprise to me because, I didn't think that I had a book in me. And and fantasy was just like the natural genre for me, I think. I've never been a fan particularly of general fiction. Growing up, I refused to watch anything that wasn't a cartoon.
Do you mean growing up?
Yeah, right, fair comment. So, as a kid I wouldn't watch anything like, Biker Grove or Children's Ward, aging, letting you know what age I am there exactly. And I only wanted to watch fantastical things, that I only wanted to read fantastical books. So when I started writing, that seemed like, a natural home for me.
really interesting you saying that you sat down and you wrote a bit and you wrote a bit and you wrote a bit more and then suddenly you had a book, because I think lots of writers often start with short form, they start with short stories rather than leaping in at the deep end. But one of our most common conversations is, why your book's so long? Jen, why? But seriously, they're gigantic beasties, some of which come in at over 200,000
Only
words.
one comes in at 200.
Some of which come in at over 200,000 words. However, originally the Copper Promise was intended to be novellas. It was 4 novellas, and you have written short stories as well. So was it you wrote a book first, then you went to novellas, then you went to short stories? And what is it about the kind of big beast of a big fantasy novel that attracts you to it? And what are the challenges of writing short fiction versus long fiction and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I've written short stories kind of growing up quite a lot, and funnily enough, I never thought that I had the stamina to write a novel. I always thought that was beyond me because it was just too many words, you know. Writing my history essays at school or writing my dissertation at art college, it all seemed like a lot of bloody work. So the idea of writing a whole novel was just like, no, that's, you know, I haven't got the patience for it. But, you know, that particular time when I started writing a scene and then a scene and then a scene, and it became a book, at the end of that book, I had this, I remember it quite vividly, just this feeling of, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, I'm supposed to write books. And so that was what I started churning out books.
It's a really lovely way to describe the creative process there, churning them out.
Churning them out. Yeah, and I mean, you said earlier about, you know, whether fantasy was the first thing I wrote, and it kind of was, but I did sort of hop around genres a bit. So I wrote a YA novel that was terrible. I wrote a science fiction / crime / private detective novel that was also terrible. I wrote a grimdark novel. Can you believe?
I can't.
No, it's fucking terrible. And eventually I kind of, you know, circled round onto the sort of fantasy that I wanted to write, and that was when I started doing the Copper Cat books, which, as you say, were novellas originally. So I had written all these books, and, you know, there was a couple of them that I thought maybe might, you know, make it onto someone's desk. So I thought, well, I'm going to do all the hard work of editing those books, but for fun, I'm just going to write this novella on the side. That's just going to be this kind of crazy knock-around, light-hearted adventure about sword and sorcery heroes, and I'll just bung it up on Amazon as a continuing novella. And I wrote the first part and bunged it up on Amazon, and
Churn.
And it didn't do amazingly well, but a lot of people had a positive response to it, and a few people said, you know, you should make this into a book. So I did. And so the fact that the Copper Promise ultimately was about 150,000 words long, but was originally a novella, is because if you add up 4 novellas, they get to be that long.
What's the excuse for the 200,000 words?
There's no excuse for that. That's because by the end of a trilogy, then everything is out of control. And it's absolutely not my fault what happened there.
I think that's really interesting to me, you talking about all the other things you've written, like grimdark and kind of detective and YA, because something that always strikes me about your works is that in some ways they feel very different from one another. So the first trilogy is very much kind of D&D adventurers, and then the second trilogy, it's got some slightly sci-fi elements, I would say, in the fantasy, and your thrillers have definitely got, you know, someone compared it to Midsummer.
Yeah.
You know, there's definitely horror elements and eldritch kind of folklore. So when you set out to write each novel, do you deliberately want to move away from what you did before, or is it a more organic writing process? And that, I guess, if your previous works have been quite disparate in tone, maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, I think originally when I was doing all these different books, it was a case of trying, you know, when you're very early in your writing career, you're trying to figure out what it is that you want to write about, I think. So that's why I went through all those genres at the time. And now I think I just don't like the idea of repeating myself, because I think I would get bored. And if when you get bored, writing something, it starts to come through. If it feels like you're churning it out, the readers can tell, I think. So it's very much a conscious decision. I think at the end of the Copper Cat trilogy, which was kind of like 3 standalone adventures, one after the other, quite light-hearted in tone mostly, and there wasn't an overarching sort of story so much in those. And so, but at the end I thought, well, I want to write more fantasy, obviously, but I want to challenge myself and make it really, really difficult. Why? I don't know. So for the Winnowing Flame trilogy, I consciously wanted to write a bigger story, a more epic kind of scale and setting, and also just weirder world building as well, because I think with the Copper Cat, it's playing very much on well-known fantasy tropes, so like taverns and dungeons and dragons and mead and quaffing ale and etc. All the stuff which I really, really love, but is very much part of a fantasy tradition that I was passionate a bit by tweaking the tropes. But with the Winnowing Flame, I wanted to create something that felt quite different. That was a different kind of world, and that was where all the sort of SF bits and pieces started to come in. And then it was at the end of the Winnowing Flame trilogy, when I'd written 6 fantasy books in a row, which was like 1,000,000 words or something, I thought I really want to write a short book, basically. So that's...
We did have a lot of conversations about the thriller, though, where Jen would be like, when you say a thriller should be around 90,000 words, is there like 60,000 words either side that we could perhaps play with? No.
Yeah, well, you're right, and it is interesting to sort of learn how to write thrillers and crime, because it is obviously a lot tighter, and you're not doing all that world building stuff, so it can be a lot shorter, which was an interesting transition.
We talked about tropes just then, and I completely agree with you that the Copper Promise in some ways does lean into some tropes, but I also think that there's a lot of subversion of tropes, because our sexy promiscuous warrior with a heart of gold in the Copper Promise is a woman, and in the 9th Reign, our Indiana Jones-esque scientific explorer is a queer woman of colour, a queer older woman of colour, and our hot noble warrior Sebastian is gay. So is this a reaction for you against the fantasy you grew up reading, or is it a deliberate process of, hey, here's a trope, wouldn't it be fun if I turned that on its head, or just, I guess, a natural, organic progression of these tropes?
Yeah, I feel like it's probably a little bit of all of those things. I did go through a period, I think, where I read like 2 or 3 or even 4 quite bad fantasy books in a row, or tried to read them, and it just occurred.
Any authors in this room?
No, I think we're safe. I each book just seemed to have no women in it. In fact, I was talking to Anna Smith-Spark earlier about a previous panel where we talked about this, and I had read the first 150 pages of quite a famous fantasy author's book, and there'd been no women on the page at all, and no women had been mentioned. So I started to think, is this like a fantasy world where there are no women? That's interesting. That's a interesting quirk. I hadn't realised that book was about this. And then, obviously, a bit later on, I realised, yes, there were women in it. They just hadn't bothered to mention any of them.
Very interesting.
Just not, no female characters of note. So when I started to write the Copper Cat books, I consciously wanted to have a central female character who got to do the cool things that a male character usually gets to do. So that she has all the kind of wisecracking lines, and she makes a series of poor decisions. She's kind of the leader of the group, even though she's often quite chaotic. And I just thought, I really want to see female characters like that. So that was definitely a conscious decision. I think a lot of stuff grew out of that as well, because it's, if I'm going to write a fantasy book, then I want to do it my way, basically. And it just seemed natural to have a variety of characters that perhaps you don't often see as often as you should in a fantasy book, I think. And obviously the Winnowing Flame, by that point, I had to kind of really embrace the idea of just having loads of female characters and loads of unusual male characters, I suppose.
Yeah, so I would say that there are definitely themes throughout your work. So the works feel quite different. You know, we've got sci-fi, we've got giant bats, we've got like weird alien worms, but we've always got kind of sweary, angry women, sexy, conflicted men, people who drink too much in every book, and unrequited love. Are these the markers of like a Jen Williams novel? And are they is that your brand distilled?
I say, sweary women who drink too much, is that my brand? I think
that's the question.
On many levels, I think that is my brand. Yes, I mean, I love writing female characters who sort of don't take any nonsense. You know, that's just the most fun to write. But you know, I think you're right. Those are the things that crop up. Just because I really love writing those things, I think those are the most fun to write. I think, and also quite consciously, because I felt so many fantasy books right from the male gaze. This idea that, you know, female characters are always described a certain way, and they often have the same roles. And I thought it would be interesting to just write fantasy books from the female gaze. So the sexy male characters, you know, is also a very conscious decision, because I don't feel like we see that enough as well. But also, you know, I like to think there are other themes, rather, you know, not just swearing and drinking in my books. So I think, you know, I often feel like I'm writing about responsibility. In the Winnowing Flame trilogy, Tor is, you know, he's running away from his responsibilities, or identity as well. I think is something that comes up a lot. So in the Coppercat trilogy, there are the Dragon Brood women. I can't remember their bloody names. Who it was a long time ago, from my point of view. That's like 5 books ago. Yeah, so they essentially don't have an identity, and they gradually get one through the course of the book. So that's something else that I quite enjoy writing about, I think.
I would definitely say, as well as the sweary, sexy, angry drinking, class is something that runs through your novels, and you're a working class writer, and I think there's a keen sense of class and what that means in your novels, whether that's Widrin feeling like an outsider, or Sebastian trapped by his nobility, or Vintage deliberately leaving behind her kind of genteel, aristocratic leanings. But it's interesting to me because I feel like fantasy novels typically love a stable boy who turns out to be king. And in your novels, if there's a stable boy, it's just a fucking stable boy. That's what he is. Yeah. And that's fine. And he might still be our hero. So I don't have the sense that you'll ever do that kind of classic trope of the hero comes from some kind of nobility or royalty. And what is it about class you like to explore in your novels? And would that ever be a trope that you chose to subvert?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's not. I don't think I don't have any interest in kings and queens and princesses and who is the rightful king of this and that. I really don't give a toss. And I think it probably is partly a working class background thing, because you don't grow up. You feel very detached from the monarchy. I mean, our lives don't really intersect with theirs. It doesn't really, doesn't impact us really what they do. And you spend a lot of time at school learning about the kings and queens, and what they got up to. You don't often learn a lot about what real people did in those times. So I think I sort of naturally am drawn to the stories of normal people and how they live their lives. I just think that's inherently more interesting. And I do hate the whole idea of someone who has a destiny to be great. I just think that's really tedious. I'm sure it's been done really well lots of times, but it just feels very easy if it's destined to be. If they're genetically destined to be great, then I just don't really care. But I do care about characters who don't have a destiny but still choose to pick up the sword and go and do the right thing anyway. I think that's just much more compelling. and interesting.
It's fascinating to me listening to you say that you wrote a grimdark novel. I can't imagine it, because I think there is so much, for me, one of the things I loved the most when I first read The Copper Promise was there's so much warmth, and the characters are good people, and that doesn't mean they're boring, it doesn't mean they're kind of two-dimensional, I'm a hero, this is how heroes behave, they've got real complexity, and some of them can be arseholes, but they're also characters that you can trust to fundamentally do the right thing. So does that reflect your worldview?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think even my grimdark novel had a happy ending. This is why I didn't end up writing any more grimdark, because I'm just terrible at it. Just generally optimistic about things, and I think that's through both trilogies. I think that's the recurring theme is the idea that generally people are largely good and are trying to do the right thing. I think that's always the centre of it. I think the grimdark novel, I'm just trying to remember what it was about. It was bonkers. It was that very early book that I'd written where I was trying to put all of the ideas at once into it. So I think it had witches and vampires and a ghost pirate that lived in a sword and like a band of warriors.
You had me, it was like witches, okay, cool. Yeah. Vampires, cool. Ghost pirate that lived in a sword, sorry, what? What now?
Yeah. Well, that's funny, that was my favourite bit, was the ghost pirate who lived in a sword. That was the best bit. So it was a hot mess in many ways, that one, but also I was trying to write a gritty thing that I didn't really feel it. It was lots of violence for the sake of violence and lots of gore and terrible things, which there's definitely plenty of terrible things happening in the Winnowing Flame trilogy. Loads of people die, but it's ultimately optimistic, I think.
I definitely think they're often, for me, it feels like you're mashing up lots of things in your book. So whilst there hasn't been a witch, vampire, ghost pirate and a sword mash-up yet, never say never, one of the things I really liked about The Copper Promise is it starts off almost like a heist novel, right? That it's kind of a bit like Dungeons and Dragons Ocean's 11, and then it spins off into something very different. And one of the things I loved about The Winnowing Flame is I felt you did something really different with the idea of vampires, that you've got tourmaline and you've got this kind of almost like supernatural warriors drinking blood, but they're very, very different from our idea of what vampires are. Are there any other kind of legends you have a hankering to twist in future books, like any things that you've seen done before that you just think, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if I turned that on its head? Yeah. If like the vampires were dying because of the blood they were drinking or whatever.
Yeah, to be honest, I feel like I don't really know until I start trying to do it, I think. The thing with tourmaline and the Eborans in the Winnowing Flame trilogy was that I think initially my idea was I wanted to have this kind of near immortal race who thought they were better than everyone else, and then it kind of naturally led to the idea of, well, what if Tolkien's elves were all complete bastards? What if they were scary, and what if they had to kill other people to live? And so that kind of naturally bled into the idea of what if they had to drink blood? And then it becomes this kind of elf vampire mashup. But it wasn't. I didn't deliberately think, well, I want to do something new with vampires, because I feel like even saying that idea in the last 20 years is like asking for trouble, because we've had so many vampires. I don't think that necessarily would have been the best thing to try and sell the book with, but it just sort of happened. And I think it was the same with The Copper Cat, that I just thought it would be really fun to start it off as this kind of crazy dungeon crawl, and then, it turns into a quest. So I don't feel like I think about it, very consciously. I feel like every time I start a new project, I kind of just naturally want to see how far I can push it into weirdness. I think I was saying to Andrew the other day, hi Andrew, if you're still there, that if whatever your outline is, you take that outline and then you make it about 20% weirder than you initially thought, and then that's where you want to be. So yeah, I feel like you're looking at me now like that explains a lot.
I'm interested though, from what you've just talked about, like what if Tolkien's elves were evil and had to drink blood? What are your influences? Because I would say for me, I detect Studio Ghibli, classic, because you love cartoons, Dragonlance, and Robin Hobb, but I know you've got some more esoteric influences, such as Stephen King. So can you speak a little to the influences we might not expect you having?
So I kind of grew up not actually reading a huge amount of fantasy to begin with. I think I was one of those kids that went to the library and just read anything. So I would read whatever was on the shelves. I read a lot, like you say, like a lot of Stephen King basically growing up. I think probably Stephen King, Terry Pratchett, and Douglas Adams growing up were the kind of the three big influences on me, which is weird because they don't really relate to each other particularly. But I think Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett obviously I think had a big impact on my sense of humour, and also the idea that humour is a good thing to have in a novel. I feel like it's kind of, for me, it's essential to have humour in a book. And then Stephen King is just such a great storyteller, and he's really into character and backgrounds and such. So they were kind of the big influences, but not the Terry Pratchett obviously is fantasy, but it's a very particular type of fantasy. In fact, because Terry Pratchett was one of the first fantasy novelists I read, I kind of thought when I started reading them that's how all fantasy was. So I was quite young, this was when I was about 10 or 11.
With the bowl haircut and a typewriter.
Yeah. Yeah, I might have grown out of the bowl haircut by then and then eventually went back to it, as you can see. Sorry, what was I saying?
Talking about thinking that Terry Pratchett was how all fantasy novels were written.
Yes. Yeah, so to me that was normal fantasy. It was only much later, actually, as an adult, I realised that he was being satirical. And so, all of those things, like the Watch and the Witches, for me, that was like my foundation in fantasy. Not realising that he's often sending up, this big history of fantasy that I hadn't actually experienced. I owe a lot to Terry Pratchett, obviously. But other than that, definitely video games ended up being a big influence, especially on the Copper Cat, because I was playing about 90 hours of Skyrim every week at that point. And then Dragon Age, obviously. And then, cartoons, anime, and also I think I'm probably one of those, the part of that kind of older millennial generation who were raised by TV programs, basically. So Star Trek and Farscape and the X-Files and all of that stuff. But yeah, absolutely Studio Ghibli, because obviously it's amazing. And Princess Mononoke in particular was a huge influence on the Wind and Flame trilogy, because I really wanted to write like massive weird forest spirits that absorb you. That was just like a really compelling idea to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's, as well as that, you've also got a lot of kind of gigantic creatures in your books. So you've got giant bats, griffins, dragons, and war beasts that bond to their rider. I absolutely love any kind of giant creature, especially if they can psychically bond with their rider in some way. But what's the appeal for you? Where do you think it comes from?
I mean, who doesn't love like a big weird beast? Especially if you grew up, watching Saturday Morning
Quite offensive to your boyfriend, but okay.
So I just love mythology, and any kind of giant dragon stuff I love, and obviously Robin Hobb's books. I think the way that she handles dragons is incredible, and that was a big influence on the Wind and Flame as well. But also just from a practical point of view, and this is probably like peeking behind the curtain too much, but it's just really, the problem with fantasy, often epic fantasy, is you have to get characters from like A to B. And a really handy way to do that is to have a big beast that flies. So often that sort of thing comes out of trying to solve a problem, like how do I get this guy over there?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, magic. a magic beast that can fly really fast. That's really handy.
Well, that actually leads me naturally on to my next question, which is that you've recently published your first thriller, which the Times described as a masterclass in suspense. But was that challenging? Because you needed to get anyone anywhere. You can't just pop them on the back of a bat, can you?
No.
And did you bring any lessons from fantasy over to crime? And when you presumably write fantasy again at some point, because I know you've got some ideas, do you think you'll bring any of the crime thriller process to them?
Yeah, it was a steep learning curve, I think, is the sort of polite way of putting that. Learning how to write a thriller is very, very different, obviously. I think sort of structurally they're different in tone.
So again, you've got sexy, conflicted men and a woman who drinks too much. So and class.
Yeah. I mean, I do remember one of the edits was I had to take out how much Heather drinks in Dog Roaster, which I thought was a normal amount of drinking. Apparently, it's not. So
right, full Gascoigne.
I think she only has like one drink now in the whole book, I think, basically, and that's probably like a fruity cider. Yeah, so it was a steep learning curve, but also very interesting. Learning how to structure something like that. I think the main thing I found difficult was, I think in fantasy you have to sell the idea of a world to your reader, and a good way of doing that is to get them really invested in the characters and make them feel real, and then by extension the world will be acceptable no matter how wild it is. And a good way of doing that is to I use like a close third-person point of view, where you can, you get in with the characters and you can hear what they're thinking and how they're reacting to stuff. But with crime and with thrillers, you often can't tell the reader everything about a character because there's all these secrets. So you have to suddenly be much more careful about what you're telling the reader and when, which is a big difference to writing fantasy books where you're just like splurging everything onto the page about everything, So that was hard, but ultimately interesting. And I do think that when I'm in the middle of writing the first draft of a fantasy book, so I feel like there is I have an urge now to do things like have more reveals and have more cliffhangers and that sort of thing, which I think is come over from writing crime. And I think in terms of what did I bring over from fantasy, I think just writing characters is, I think, probably my favourite thing to do. So I never feel lost trying to write a character because I think that's probably my main strength.
I would say it's one of your greatest strengths. And actually, having bullied Jen quite a lot about how long her books are, I always read them on my Kindle, and I'm often shocked by how long they are because they haven't felt long. Because I'm just so swept along.
See, they don't feel long, so it's all right.
I'm going to open things up to people in a couple of minutes, but I'm just going to ask a final couple of questions. So, firstly, what are you writing next? Sounds like a fantasy. Can you tell us anything about it?
It's still very early stages. It's in that kind of bit that I quite enjoy, where you haven't quite figured everything out yet, so anything could happen still. But there's two main characters, I guess. One is a woman who is a kind of living magical weapon, and she has no memory of her former life. And the other character is a girl who's been raised by griffins, because I still need some transport to get around the world. I mean, no, but yeah, she's been raised by griffins, so she's quite wild and cool. So yeah, it's just that it's very early stages. I'm enjoying it. It's really nice, and I'm currently waiting for edits back on the second thriller, which I'm sure will be a learning experience once again.
And what's the second thriller called?
It's called Scarecrow Stitch at the moment.
In America?
In America it's called Games for Dead Girls.
Very
nice and creepy, yeah.
Creepy. And finally, what advice do you have for writers who are trying to get published?
I would say, do you know what? People always used to email me and say, can you give me some advice about how to get published and stuff? And I would write these really long, detailed replies, and no one ever replied to me.
So rude.
It's like, and I think it's because my advice is like too realistic or something. No one wants to hear it. But I think the main thing to remember is that writing is a long game, especially if you want to be published. So you've got to kind of shore up your patience, you know. And I was speaking earlier about the first books that I wrote. I mean, there were about 5 before I wrote The Copper Promise, and at least 3 of those were dog shit. So,
such a way with words.
That's what they pay me for. Yeah, so there's a big learning process, and that's fine. You know, that's all part of it, and it's really valuable. Even if at the end of the book, it's not going to go anywhere, you've still learnt loads by finishing it.
Yeah, I agree.
So definitely, you just got to be really persistent, you've got to have a lot of patience, and you've got to really love the act of writing, because there's a lot of it involved. Because I think when I was first published, what I didn't realise is how often you have to edit things, how often you have to read your own work, and if you're not really in love with the process, it's going to be agonising. Because it's a lot of hard work, basically. But at the end, really great, and it's the best job to have, basically.
Well, I'm going to open things up to the floor now, so if anyone has a question, can you raise your hand? Yes.
Hi, just because you mentioned that you're doing a first draft right now, I wondered if I could ask you a little bit about your process. I mean, do you show people stuff as you're going? Do you keep it totally under lock and key until you're done?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't even know she was writing a fantasy novel, by the way. So.
I mean, yeah, I don't tend to show people the first draft because, well, for lots of reasons, really. Firstly, because it's usually really rough and it's embarrassing. And secondly, because I've always felt that if you show people things that aren't finished, the feedback you're going to get, it won't necessarily help, because what you often find when you write a whole first draft is when you get to the end, you realise that there's actually loads of stuff you need to change at the beginning, which is fine because that's all part of the process. So if you get advice in the middle, it's not really worth it, because everything could change anyway. So yeah, I definitely don't show people my first draft. I used to use beta readers before I was published, and that's useful. It's difficult sometimes to find the right people to be beta readers, because I mean, you will either get, sometimes you will get people who will just read it and then send you a one-line back going, yeah, seems all right. And it's like, that's of no use. It's nice that you think it's all right, but it doesn't really help, So what you need to find are probably other writers, who have have some experience of writing as well, perhaps, or just really, really big readers who love that particular genre can be really helpful as well. And they have to be really patient, because what you need, is an actual commentary on, how they felt about the book, basically. And then, I guess the second draft I will also do myself without showing anyone, and then eventually that draft will go to Juliet first, and then it will go to my editor, because of the constraints of how much time you have in publishing, I don't really have time for beta readers anymore. But I'm lucky because Juliet's obviously really clever and knows everything about
Obviously.
And then of course my editor also is great at this stuff, and she knows everything about it, so I'm quite happy for them to be my experts in this kind of regard.
Yeah. Awesome. Anyone else? Yes.
Can you tell us about Super Relaxed Fantasy Club? Is it like a incubator, a support group? What part does that play?
Well, Super Relaxed Fantasy Club, me and Den started, how many years ago?
8 or 9.
8 or 9 years ago. It was after, I can't remember which convention, but we came home from it and said, wouldn't it be nice if you could do just the drinking part of a convention? Because, we have very specific interests. without having to do all the organising and have a committee and all that stuff. So, you know, we kind of just thought, well, let's all get together at a place and we can all hang out and have a drink and maybe someone can read something. And that was it. That was the...
Well, no, the other idea was gender parity. So
yeah.
was all, it was also because they'd seen a lot of panels where it was all men. And so the idea for Super Relaxed Fantasy Club was there had to be gender parity. So if you had 2 readers, one was a man, one was a woman, you had 4, 2 men, 2 women.
Yeah, you're totally right. I was just immediately went for the superficial reasons we started it. Yeah, we just thought, wouldn't that be great if you know, all genders had an equal kind of say on things. And then it kind of grew from there. So I think we started it at the Royal Festival Hall. Do you remember that? And it was, we just literally took over a corner of the stairs in the Royal Festival Hall, and I think it was about 10 of us doing these little readings and chats in between Ian McKellen doing the announcements for people to go and go to their performances and stuff, which is very surreal. And then it moved on to other venues and stuff. So yeah, me and Den stepped away from it, I guess about 3 years ago now, maybe more than that, just because we just didn't have time to do it justice anymore. So,
but it's still going, just
it's
with
still
different
going.
organisers now.
Yeah, I think of it fondly.
Anyone else? Yes.
As well as being a writer, you're also a visual artist. So
Yeah, I drew you guys.
yes, I like to pay you for art. So I was just interested in how different the sort of process of visual art is compared to the process of writing, or if there's any kind of like crossover in what you do.
Yeah, that's interesting because obviously I went to art college thinking I was going to be an illustrator and spent a lot of time learning how to do children's picture book illustration, which I really did enjoy, and then came out of art college. And art college is great, but unless you're a certain type of personality, I think it can destroy your interest in art. And so for a long period I was like, I don't want to draw anything ever again. But now I've kind of, because of being able to do digital art and the lockdown as well and all these different things, I've started doing commissions and things. And the thing about art, or drawing, that I really love, and it's completely different to writing, it's like the opposite. So when I'm drawing, it's like I don't think at all. It's like I kind of go to this very peaceful place where I'm just thinking about the line on the page and what looks right, and it becomes very sort of focused. It's almost like a kind of meditation. That sounds really wank, I'm sorry, but it's very peaceful for me and quite calming, whereas writing is kind of the opposite, because you're trying to think of, 800 things at once and kind of trying to hold the whole book in your head continually. So that is kind of as fun, but in a completely different way. So it's kind of nice to be able to do some writing and then do some drawing to kind of have a break, I suppose. So yeah, it's been great to kind of get that bit of myself back, because I think it helps my mental health, to be honest.
And you can commission artwork, which I have done.
Yeah, Juliet's like
many
my
times.
biggest customer. I think I've done like
She did our
4 or
agency
5.
Christmas card last year,
Yeah.
and there's Neville and Luna, my cats, and quite a few as well.
Yes.
Well, on that happy note, thank you everyone for coming along and for some great questions, and thank you so much, Jen, our guest of honour. Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you, Juliet, for all the amazing questions and for being a superstar.
And thanks, Andrew, for watching.